Hi, it's Andrew Walker here. I'm the co-founder of the Property Academy. Now, the Property Academy is a business that's been built by property investors for property investors, where we give education around the property space. So just, whether you want to buy and sell properties, you want to get into student accommodation or multi-let, we have a range of property coaches at the Property Academy and various online property courses to help investors excel in their property journey. Now, today I've got Bruno, and I wanted to chat to Bruno about some of the most common questions we get on a regular basis, which is all around, should I put my property into a trust? Should my properties be held by a company, or should I own them personally? And I really want to go into a bit of detail with Bruno today. But I think, Bruno, what will be useful for us is, could you just start by introducing yourself, your company, and how we are working together on this project?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Bruno Simão. I'm an attorney by profession. I've been involved in the property field and the commercial field for the last 15 years. My company is Intergen. I do also have a law firm that I practice under, but Intergen is my wealth preservation company. So what this means is this company focuses on assisting property investors and business people to make sure that they structure their investments in their portfolio in the most efficient, tax efficient, protection efficient way that the best way possible. We've seen from experience, all the students from a Property Academy that we've worked with, that we've assisted in establishing these structures to make sure that as they embark on their property journey, that they really make the best out of it. And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely, Bruno. Now, let's get into the crunch of this, right? So when we look at it, I want you to tell us, first of all, what are the entities that one can use to own or hold a property? Let's just go through that very quickly. And then what I want you to touch on after that is, what are some of the considerations we're going to start thinking about if we're going to choose a trust, or we're going to choose a company or a personal name? So maybe if you can answer both of those now, and then what I'd like to do is throw you a few scenarios.
Sure, absolutely. So a very basic answer to your first question is there's only a certain amount of entities that or persons that one can use to actually hold properties. So obviously your individual capacity, so that's in your personal name, and that's one that you actually find quite often. Then obviously you have companies. So this is what you see as the PTY limiteds of the world. And these normally actually hold quite a few properties. A lot of people use them to hold properties. There's other ones like, for example, your public companies, but you tend to find from a property investor perspective, no one actually goes that advanced just yet. Your trusts is also very popular way of holding properties for estate planning. And then you do tend to find people that hold properties in CCs, closed corporations. But since that was done away with quite a few years ago, it is being phased out, and there's very, very few CCs that are left.
Sure. And what I tend to find, Bruno, with a lot of our students coming through, you're 100% right. Most of the students that do come through the Property Academy say, hey, Andrew, I do have 2, 3, or 4 properties, of which in a lot of cases, unfortunately, there are negative cash flowing. And that's where we start, talking about what entity to use. But now, before we just go use a trust, because in my opinion, it's only my opinion, a trust structure isn't for everyone, okay? And
Absolutely.
I think trust will suit certain individuals because it depends, I guess, on their goals, on tax efficiency. What are those considerations?
So I work off 3 fundamentals. We're looking at structuring from an asset protection perspective, a tax efficiency perspective, and a financing efficiency perspective. Every investor will weigh differently on one of these fundamentals. And that's where the structuring needs to be tailor-made, because you do tend to find that a lot of structures are force-fed down investors' throats, and it's not always necessarily the best for them. And sometimes it ends up being way more expensive than they had anticipated and entirely unnecessary. Finding the perfect balance between these 3 fundamentals, and not only finding the current perfect balance, but also looking forward and knowing that if you're going in a certain direction, that you structure it in a way that you can quickly either change or that you just have foresight and structure it knowing that that is where you're going to be. And this is a conversation that we have with each and every investor so that we're able to properly assess his goals and advise him on which structure to actually use.
Absolutely. Now let's say, Bruno, let's say someone watching this video then has two properties in their personal name. They rental properties. Let's assume this individual, his or her long-term goal is never to sell. They want to hold these and they want to build a profitable property portfolio moving forwards. So yes, we will give them the skills. We'll show them where to buy, what to buy. We'll help them negotiate. That's our job, right? Through the academy. What advice would you give someone if they're going to build up a property portfolio that they want to leave behind for their kids or their partner as a legacy? What entities would you start looking at?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. So what's interesting is my business partner, a co-director of Intergen, is a chartered accountant. So normally when we have this conversation, we actually bounce the ideas off each other, and especially when chatting about tax and finance and asset protection. But this is exactly the perfect scenario to answer. Normally to start off with, especially from the legal perspective, having properties in your own personal name is the first issue that we have to address, because the outright issue with that is asset protection, no question about it. And the problem with asset protection is anything that's in your personal name is exposed to any debt you in your personal name incur. Now, it's very easy to incur debt in your personal name because think about it. Life is life. You go around in your personal capacity every day. You don't get married in a company, right?
Yeah.
You get married as an individual. So all these things impact the assets that you have in your personal name. And the more assets you have, guess what? The more exposed you are. So the first primary goal that we have with structuring is to try and avoid assets in one's personal name and try have these assets in any other entity, in fact. I mean, if you forget tax efficiency for now and financing efficiency, out of your personal name into another entity. Now, granted, Andrew, I'm not now going around saying that everyone should actually move every single asset. The reality is, yes, there's some people that are entirely comfortable, feel that they have very, very secure jobs, no worries about retrenchments. They don't feel that they're ever going to incur enough debt where these assets are going to be exposed. And sure, if they live that conservatively, maybe their personal circumstances allow them to do a couple of things in their personal name. But think about it, property investors. There is a level of chance that you take with everything. And you need to make sure that you're protected, especially with assets that grow to that extent.
Yeah.
So yeah, the big one there would be asset protection, making sure that it's not in your personal name, that it's in the name of some sort of entity.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, you can step it up a notch, but I think that we'll actually touch on a little bit later, if I'm not mistaken. So going back to the example of the scenario that you were playing out, so the second thing that one needs to look at is tax efficiency. Now, this is normally where my business partner Shilibor Mutiba comes in, but what we normally look at or discuss with the clients is your short-term tax efficiency and your long-term tax efficiency, because that is vital. Depending on your goals, if you intend selling the property sooner rather than later, you'd probably approach it differently. But your example, for instance, is keeping the property long-term. Now, keeping the property long-term, one needs to start thinking, wait, what happens if you as an individual pass away? Now, when you pass away, people might not realize, but SARS expects you to pay transfer duty. Transfer duty is very, very, very expensive. People expect when you pass away, estate duty, transfer duty. So now when you pass away, it's estate duty that's payable. Now that you've passed away, the property needs to go to somebody else. So going to somebody else, transfer duty will be payable.
Yep.
Executors' fees are going to be payable, because now executors' fees are calculated on the value of your estate, and the executor gets paid from that. So now that is going to be payable. What about conveyancing fees? Somebody needs to transfer this property, so the attorneys are going to charge a fee for this. Now, if you've built up a massive portfolio, can you imagine 10 times or 10 times conveyancing fees, 10 times transfer duty? It's a fortune.
No, exactly. Now, Bruno, I remember speaking to someone about 7 years ago about this. You know, when when I moved back from the UK to South Africa, and I started setting up my trust. And the rule of thumb in South Africa is when one dies, it's a third of your wealth. That's the rule of thumb.
Pretty
They
much.
say it's
Yeah.
about a third of. So if you're
Pretty
worth
much.
100 million through property, that's
Yeah.
33 million rand gone.
Yeah. So we did different calculations with different clients, and we actually hit an average at a stage of about 40%, which
Jeez.
it's massive. It's crazy, right? And imagine all of that just goes off to the different institutions, mostly SARS, granted, but
Sure.
it's money that didn't have to go to them.
So, for example, if that portfolio was bought in a trust, for example, or in a PTY where the shares were owned by a trust,
Exactly.
and I guess there's different ways of doing this. Can a trust ever die, or what happens if the properties were in a trust and that individual dies? What happens?
See, and that's the beauty behind it. So trust structures in South Africa are such a controversial thing, but they've been around for all these years, and no one they seem secure because this is how people store their wealth, or keep their wealth, or preserve it rather. So the beauty behind trust is it's the only, call it, entity that, number one, continues in perpetuity. So nothing can happen to it unless the trust deed provides for it to be dissolved. So it just continues on and on and on until somebody decides to do away with it, number one. But what makes it very special is it's one of the only entities that's really protected from an asset protection perspective. The reason I say this is, think about it. If you own a company, you're a shareholder of this company, right?
Yep.
Now, the company owns the property. So that means if something happens and there's debt inside that company, yes, the property is exposed, but everyone else is safe, and you're safe in your personal capacity. But what happens if something happens in your personal capacity? Those shares are going to be attached. So now that company is not safe, that property is not safe, because ultimately, if you do something wrong, creditors can track back to your shares, which will find the company, that can find the property, and now all of a sudden you've exposed that asset. This doesn't happen with trusts. With trusts, you have trustees that simply take care of the assets. It doesn't vest in them in any more of a capacity than a caretaker. And the beneficiaries don't actually have any claim to those assets. The trustees, in their discretion, will distribute if and when they decide. This means that these assets just sit in limbo and no one can actually claim any of them. They get dealt with by the trustee, and that's what makes it secure. And that's why buying a property in a trust or a company that's owned by the trust, from an asset protection perspective, is the safest way. From a tax efficiency perspective, you pointed it out. It just keeps on going, which means that if you pass away and you're a beneficiary and possibly a trustee, all that really happens is your name gets scratched off and maybe a new name gets added on. That's it. That's the impact that you in your personal capacity would have on that trust, is simply a scratch out, and your family would continue to benefit from the benefits of your portfolio.
Sure. And then obviously, Bruno, if one does go down that road of setting up trusts, there's obviously a bit of work to be done with that. It's not as easy as just opening a trust, is it? It's quite lengthy. Yeah. There's a cost attached to it. We have to maintain it, make sure our books are up to date. Maybe just very high level, what's involved in setting up and running a trust structure?
All right. Well, so practically speaking, the setting up of the trust normally involves making sure that you've got a proper trust deed that's drafted. Now, this is very, very important, because if the trust deed isn't drafted correctly and you unintentionally create a vesting trust as opposed to a discretionary trust, you've got problems. Because now those beneficiaries suddenly have a claim against the trust, and their creditors can go after the trust. So the actual trust deed itself is vital. Very, very important you get it done by someone that knows what they're doing. Once this is drafted and you're happy with it, it gets registered at the master's office. The master's office gives a number, and from that day, this trust actually comes into existence, if you want to put it like that. Once it comes into existence, the master's office does expect, and the reason for this is to avoid abuses, does expect that an independent trustee be appointed. Now, all this really entails is there needs to be almost a supervisory professional that ensures that you aren't using this trust as your own little personal piggy bank. Because remember, the reality is that by putting things in a trust, it's not an extension of yourself. The trust needs to operate independently for the benefit of the beneficiaries. But obviously, every investor wants that. So this independent trustee is there to make sure that an investor doesn't try, for example, to dispose of assets at way below market value to one of his friends and then try pocket something to the back. That's the goal of the independent trustees. He verifies that things look okay, make sure that the finances are done, that money hasn't gone missing, that the beneficiaries are getting things according to the trust deed. And once that job is completed, the independent trustee has functionally completed his tasks. There is obviously monthly costs associated with that, because this trustee is obviously consistently involved in the operation of the trust. But believe it or not, it's not actually terribly expensive. It ranges between, I think, 300 to 500 rand, 500 rand a month.
100%, Bruno. Now, my last question for you is, let's talk about buying and selling our property, flipping properties. If someone came to you and said, look, Bruno, I've already got 4 or 5 properties. I'm happy with my structure. I want to now flip a few properties, or I've come across a very good opportunity. Would you advise that they put those properties through the existing entity, or should they flip these in their personal name or set up an SPV, a special purpose vehicle for the flipping? What's your advice on that?
Look, it's so this obviously is tailored for the individual, how many properties they intend flipping. Now, the reason I say this is, if you're flipping as an individual. So again, now we're going back to asset protection. From an asset protection perspective, you always worry about keeping assets in your personal name for way too long. So that's something that you'd like to avoid. So from a flipping perspective, if you're doing one flip in your personal name, sometimes, you know what, it's not the end of the world, because at the end of the day, it's a short term. And so in your personal name, it could work. But doing too many in your personal name starts becoming a bit of a problem. And the one warning that I'd like to give people is, if you start doing it as a business, where this is a primary business, you actually start moving from having to pay capital gains to having to pay income tax. So this is also a warning sign that if it's not a capital gain anymore, if you haven't held the property for a bit of time in order to gain some sort of interim benefit from it as a capital asset, you could actually change what tax you pay on it. But if we're just looking, for example, at a specific flip, a lot of people do it in their personal names. Some people, for instance, actually do it in the trust. One of the tricks of the trust, and this actually goes back to the tax efficiency and short-term tax benefits, is our law has a principle that's called the conduit principle. What that really means is the beneficiaries of a trust, if the trust passes its income directly through it and to the beneficiaries, you won't pay tax in the trust name, you'll pay tax in the hands of the beneficiaries. So what does this mean? Tax rate for a trust is quite expensive. It's quite high. But maybe a tax rate for your beneficiaries, you might be at 28%. Maybe your son is at somewhere around 20%, whatever the case might be. And if you're passing the benefits on to them directly, you'd pay tax in their personal name. So something, for example, like flipping, it actually works quite well, because if you do it directly in the trust, all that money that comes in, you can actually pass on to your beneficiaries and allow them to pay capital gains in their name versus in the trust name, which is a lot cheaper, because capital gains directly in a trust is a lot higher than in your individual name.
Exactly. So basically what we're saying here, Bruno, for our audience, is that there is no one size that fits all, right? Because you've got to sit down with the individual and go, what are your long-term plans? You know, how long are you looking to hold on to these properties? Because if we're looking to sell the property in, say, 12 or 24 months, why are you even considering moving them into an entity, for example? And what's more important to you? Is it asset protection or is it tax efficiency? And that's why I always say to my students, you know, at the Property Academy, we're going to help you with the plan. We're going to help you with your property plan, that is. What type of properties are we going to be buying? How many do we need to get to achieve our goals? And where you come in, Bruno, is you there to make sure that they're protecting it and that they're buying them in the right entity. So I think just to
Absolutely.
close off, Bruno, what's one last thing that you'd like to leave us today?
Well, one point that actually, and it's a good point to close off, and this is exactly where we see the synergy behind the different types of educations that we normally partake in. But one of the fundamentals that you guys teach, especially from a financing perspective, that use other people's money, that notion. And one of the fundamentals that we use in structuring is very similar to that. It's the financing efficiency. You want to be able to have your properties structure or your structure in such a way that you can take advantage. You buy property in your personal name, the bank's only going to give you so much money until your affordability gets capped. You buy it in a company, for example, you could probably multiply that by 4, 5 if you do it correctly. And I mean, you know this, you guys teach about it. We teach about it when people walk in. Bottom line is, it's not about, yes, take a trust. In fact, take a trust just so you can get more properties, get more income, and eventually it'll pay all the costs that you've spent maintaining that trust. It's really, really the right consideration when it comes to property investments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that, Bruno.